The first sign something was off wasn't the notice itself, it was the urgency stamped all over it. The board didn't just want compliance, they wanted it fast, and they wanted it before anyone could ask why. As morning light cut through the blinds and the air hummed with lawn equipment outside, I realized the inspection rush wasn't about rules at all. It was about control, and the clock was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. I'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to recognize patterns. The association usually moved slowly, drowning everything in committees and polite delays. This time was different. The timeline was compressed, the language sharper, and the pressure unmistakable. It felt like a test designed to make someone flinch, and I had a sinking feeling that someone was supposed to be me. The question that kept circling my thoughts was simple: could rushed inspections expose the bluff by noon, or would I fold first? As the sun climbed, I replayed how this all started, the small friction points that turned into a full-blown HOA nightmare. The irony was that nothing about my property had changed overnight. What changed was the board's appetite for leverage. Somewhere between breakfast and the first email refresh, I decided I wasn't going to panic. Panic was the reaction they were counting on. I poured coffee, the bitter steam rising, and pulled out the folder I kept for association paperwork. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Years in this community taught me that paper trails mattered more than intentions. If this was going to become an HOA versus homeowner showdown, I needed to know exactly where the lines were drawn. The background to all of this was painfully ordinary. Our association prided itself on being proactive, which translated to a rotating cast of volunteers enforcing a thick rulebook with varying enthusiasm. Most months were quiet. Then there were months like this one, when a new board member decided visibility equaled effectiveness. The atmosphere shifted, like clouds rolling in before a storm, and suddenly everyone was looking over fences and measuring hedges. The particular rule in question had been on the books for years, rarely enforced and vaguely worded. It lived in the covenants as a general standard, not a checklist item, which made it perfect for selective scrutiny. I knew that because I'd read the section more than once, usually after a neighbor whispered about a warning letter. The board's own agenda from last quarter even listed it as low priority, a detail I'd clipped and saved from a board agenda excerpt that floated through my inbox months earlier. That excerpt mattered now. It showed intent, or at least inconsistency, and inconsistency is where authority gets shaky. The board had never flagged my property before, not during routine walks, not during seasonal reviews. Yet here was a sudden inspection notice framed as urgent, accompanied by a tone that suggested imminent consequences without spelling them out. The sound of a leaf blower droned outside as I read the notice again, noting how it referenced standards without citing specifics. What made it more unsettling was the social layer. A few neighbors texted vague warnings, the kind that carry more anxiety than information. The association thrives on that ambient pressure, the idea that non-compliance equals embarrassment. I could almost feel eyes turning toward my place, measuring, judging, speculating. That's how Karen neighbor drama takes root, not with facts but with implication. I didn't respond immediately. Silence, at least at first, was a strategy. Instead, I mapped out what the board might be doing behind the scenes. Rapid inspections compress response time, which limits a homeowner's ability to gather context or push back. It's a classic power move, one that looks procedural on paper but feels personal in practice. I reminded myself that procedure cuts both ways. Section 3 of this mess began the moment I realized the inspection rush wasn't isolated. Similar notices went out to a handful of homes, all clustered near the next board vote. That timing wasn't accidental. It suggested the inspections were less about maintenance and more about setting a tone. As clouds thickened outside and the light dimmed, I started connecting dots that pointed to a broader play. I pulled the association's inspection policy and compared it to the notice language. There were gaps, small but meaningful, where discretion replaced definition. Those gaps are where pressure lives. I also checked timestamps on emails and posts, noticing how communication spiked after a contentious meeting. The board wanted to look decisive, and inspections were their chosen theater. I began assembling what I called my calm kit. It wasn't about defiance, it was about readiness. I printed the inspection policy, highlighted the discretionary sections, and attached that old agenda excerpt showing the rule's previous status. I also noted neighbors who'd experienced similar scrutiny and asked, carefully, about their timelines. Patterns emerged, and patterns weakened Bluff's. The closer noon crept on the clock, the clearer it became this wasn't just my problem, it was a test case. If I rushed and stumbled, the board would tighten the screws across the block. If I stayed composed and precise, the entire narrative could shift. The ticking wasn't just counting down my response window, it was counting down the board's credibility. By late morning, the neighborhood felt unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound sharper. I reviewed everything one more time, not to memorize it but to understand it. Authority depends on confidence, and confidence depends on preparation. I wasn't planning a confrontation, I was preparing for scrutiny to meet scrutiny. This was the moment where small disputes tip into something larger. The inspection panic had already done its job by raising stakes and drawing attention. What it hadn't done yet was prove its case. As I set my papers aside and looked at the time, I knew the next few hours would decide whether this stayed a nuisance or turned into a defining HOA versus homeowner moment. By the time mid-morning settled in, the pressure wasn't subtle anymore. Notifications kept stacking up, each one worded politely but carrying the same undertone. Hurry up. The association's committee had shifted from suggestion to insistence, and the sound of a distant garbage truck rattling down the street felt like a countdown bell. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I focused on documenting everything in real time, noting timestamps and saving copies, because rushed authority hates a paper trail. Section 3 deepened as the inspections began rolling through the neighborhood. I watched from my front window as board volunteers moved briskly, clipboards tucked close, barely pausing between properties. The speed alone told me enough. This wasn't about careful assessment, it was about visibility and intimidation. Neighbors peeked through curtains, the sunlight flashing off windshields as cars slowed, curiosity mixing with unease. I reviewed the association's own inspection window language again, comparing it to the pace unfolding outside. There was no requirement for immediacy, no mandate for same-day turnaround, yet here they were acting as if delay equaled defiance. That disconnect was important. It meant the urgency was manufactured. Manufactured urgency is fragile if you don't feed it panic. I sent a measured acknowledgement to the committee, confirming receipt and asking for clarification on criteria. No demands, no accusations, just process. The reply came faster than expected, curt and vague, emphasizing expectations without answering specifics. That was another crack. Vague authority relies on assumption, and assumption collapses under scrutiny. As noon approached, the conflict-rising phase hit its stride. The association doubled down, circulating a general reminder about community standards that felt pointed without naming names. It landed in everyone's inbox at once, amplifying social pressure. The hum of cicadas outside underscored the tension, a steady backdrop to a neighborhood collectively holding its breath. I reached out quietly to two neighbors who'd received similar notices. We compared language and timing, discovering near-identical phrasing. That uniformity suggested coordination rather than coincidence. One neighbor mentioned a prior assurance from the board that inspections would be educational, not punitive. I noted it, another inconsistency to add to the stack. The evidence props started to line up. Alongside the board agenda excerpt, I now had the inspection policy printout marked with discrepancies and saved copies of the broadcast reminder. Each piece on its own was mundane. Together, they told a story of overreach. This wasn't revenge yet, it was foundation. The board thought speed would force mistakes, but speed was doing the opposite. It was revealing seams. Every rushed email, every hurried walk-by, made their authority look less deliberate. If they wanted compliance theater, they were giving me a behind-the-scenes pass. I stayed visible but calm. When an inspection volunteer finally approached my property, I acknowledged them without confrontation and noted the process. No arguments, no scrambling. The inspection was brief, almost perfunctory, reinforcing my suspicion that conclusions were pre-written. As the volunteer moved on, I felt the balance shift slightly, like weight redistributing on a scale. By early afternoon, Section 4, the escalation, was unavoidable. The association followed up with firmer language, referencing potential consequences without naming them. It was an old tactic. Let imagination do the work. The breeze picked up, rattling leaves, and the mood in the neighborhood grew brittle. I responded again, this time attaching excerpts from the inspection policy and politely requesting confirmation of alignment. The tone remained neutral, but the substance was pointed. You can challenge authority without raising your voice. The reply took longer this time, and when it came, it sidestepped the question entirely. That dodge mattered. It signaled uncertainty. Authority that knows its right answers directly. Authority that's bluffing buys time. I began outlining next steps, not as threats but as contingencies, documenting everything as if someone else might read it later. The escalation spread socially. A neighbor mentioned at the mailbox that the board seemed on edge. Another speculated about upcoming changes. The association's attempt to assert control was creating chatter instead of compliance. The sound of a plane overhead briefly drowned out conversation, a reminder that the world beyond this block kept moving. At around the 20-minute mark of this ordeal, the stakes crystallized. This wasn't just about inspections anymore. It was about whether the board could enforce by pressure alone. If they failed here, their credibility would take a hit that no reminder email could fix. The closer we got to the end of the inspection rush, the more visible their gamble became. The board issued another message, urging cooperation and unity. It landed flat. Once you push too hard, calls for unity sound hollow. I added it to my records, another example of tone shifting under stress. Up to this point, the association had accelerated inspections to intimidate, relying on urgency and implication rather than clear rules. By staying composed, documenting inconsistencies, and asking procedural questions, I turned their speed into evidence of overreach. As Section 5 began to take shape, I prepared for retaliation, not with confrontation but with structure. I organized my materials into a single, coherent packet, ready if needed. The afternoon light slanted across my desk, highlighting margins and notes. Preparation felt less like defense and more like leverage. The board still thought this was about catching me unprepared. They didn't see that every hour they rushed made the eventual reckoning heavier. Whatever came next would hinge on whether they escalated again or quietly retreated, and I was ready for either path. Retaliation didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in on polished language and tightened timelines. The association sent a formal follow-up that afternoon, framed as clarification but clearly meant to reassert dominance. It referenced an internal review and attached a final notice dated May 12th, positioned as routine even though it hadn't existed that morning. The paper felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that comes from implication rather than ink. I didn't react publicly. Instead, I compared the notice against the inspection policy and the earlier messages, lining up phrases and dates. The mismatch was obvious. The notice implied prior warnings that hadn't happened, a leap that only works if no one checks. I added the document to my packet, labeling it carefully, because retaliation often creates the cleanest evidence. The sensory shift was subtle but real. Afternoon heat pressed in, the house ticking softly as it settled, and the neighborhood buzz turned from anxious to curious. People had noticed the board's sudden intensity, and curiosity is dangerous for authority built on assumption. I could feel the theme of abuse of power turning, inch by inch, toward accountability. This was the moment where pressure could flip. If the board pushed consequences without foundation, they risked exposing themselves to scrutiny they couldn't control. If they paused, they'd admit the rush had been a bluff. Either way, their next move would decide who held the leverage. I responded with precision. No accusations, no emotion, just a structured reply referencing their own documents and asking for confirmation of process alignment. I attached the inspection policy excerpts, the board agenda excerpt showing prior priorities, and highlighted the timeline gap around the final notice dated May 12th. It read like a checklist, not a challenge. The reply didn't come quickly. Silence stretched into the early evening, broken only by sprinklers clicking on down the street. That silence was information. Boards that feel confident respond fast. Boards that realize they've overreached slow down, hoping momentum will fade. I documented the delay and waited. By the next morning, the association shifted tone again, suggesting a review period and thanking residents for patience. The urgency vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. That pivot told me everything. The inspection panic had run headlong into preparation, and preparation doesn't flinch. The climax wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it. It was satisfying in a quieter, sharper way. The board circulated a general update acknowledging procedural adjustments and postponing any determinations tied to the rushed inspections. No names, no apologies, just a retreat wrapped in neutrality. The morning light was clear and cool, birdsong cutting through the calm, and the neighborhood exhaled. I didn't celebrate. I archived. Every document went back into the folder, labeled and dated, because the real victory was establishing boundaries. This wasn't just a Karen neighbor drama moment. It was a demonstration that calm, documented responses can dismantle manufactured urgency. The association had put its authority on trial by noon and discovered it needed more than speed to win. The real consequence for the board wasn't embarrassment, it was precedent. Once residents see that pressure can be questioned, it loses potency. That realization ripples outward, changing how power is exercised long after the notices stop. Aftermath settled in over the next few days. Conversations at mailboxes sounded different, less hushed, more analytical. The board meetings returned to their usual pace, agendas padded with discussion instead of declarations. There was a cost. The trust, once strained, takes time to rebuild, and the association's image as a steady hand had taken a hit. For me, the lesson was simple. Preparation isn't antagonism, it's self-respect. In this homeowners association drama, the most effective response wasn't loud resistance but quiet readiness. The HOA nightmare ended not with fireworks but with a recalibration of power, which felt like justice in its own right. If this inspection standoff felt familiar, like share, subscribe, turn on notifications, drop your HOA experience in the comments, and thanks for watching as we break down how rushed authority met calm preparation. Next time, I'll tell you about a different block where a budget shuffle sparked a satisfying revenge story that unfolded slower but cut deeper, proving that patience can be the sharpest tool when control starts slipping.